Order. Can I welcome everybody to this meeting of the Education Select Committee. This morning we are holding our second public oral evidence session on our inquiry on reading for pleasure. We are seeking to understand with this inquiry why we have seen such a decline in children reading for pleasure and what can be done, importantly, to reverse that trend and to get children back into reading. We are really pleased to be holding this second evidence session in the same week as World Book Day, and the committee has lots of activities planned to help mark World Book Day and also to kind of further keep our inquiry in the public domain and to encourage further interest and evidence from members of the public. So you're very welcome to our session this morning. Can I invite any members of the committee who would like to make a declaration of interest to do so this morning? I don't know if we've got any interests.
Not necessarily for this panel, but for the later panel, I'd just like to share that I am a member of the APPG for dyslexia.
Thank you very much.
So am I.
Great. Okay, thank you very much for that. And now can I invite our witnesses for this first panel to introduce yourselves to us, please, starting with Jonathan Douglas.
I'm the Chief Executive of the National Literacy Trust. We're a charity that exists to tackle disadvantage with literacy. We work in about 8,000 schools with the lowest levels of literacy, the highest levels of child poverty across the UK. And we've got 21 local teams around the UK in towns and cities and communities where there are significant reading challenges working on the ground. And this year we're working with the Department for Education and other government departments on the National Year of Reading.
Thank you. Annie Crombie.
Hello everyone, lovely to be here. I'm Annie Crombie, I'm the co-chief executive of Booktrust, and Booktrust is 100 years old just, and we were founded as a reading for pleasure charity, so to promote the habit of reading, which is still part of our charitable objects. And we run large-scale reading programmes in secondary schools and for children in care, but our biggest work is in the early years, where we are best known for Book Start, which is delivered in all 152 or 3 local authorities, and we reach around 1 million children and families a year in the early years through Book Start.
Thank you. And Debbie Hicks.
Hello everyone, I'm the Creative Director and founder member of UK reading charity The Reading Agency. We deliver national evidence-based reading for pleasure programmes in communities, including the Summer Reading Challenge, which is our flagship programme. We work very closely with public libraries as well as schools and other partners. And we are committed to delivering social and personal change through the proven power of reading, empowering access to its pleasure and benefits, building skills and learning, health and well-being, and connected communities. And our focus is very much on reaching those who need these benefits the most. That includes helping children and young people to develop confident reading identities and lifelong reading journeys that help them to live happy, healthy and thriving lives. But we also support reading for adults, not only for their own benefit and enjoyment, but also because positive adult reading role modelling is so important in families, in communities and in the classroom.
Thank you very much indeed. So we have heard that there's been a steep decline in children and young people reading for pleasure in recent years, and indeed that is one of the main reasons why we're undertaking this inquiry. Could each of you set out for us what you see as the main causes of that decline? And I might start with Jonathan Douglas, if that's okay.
So the decline is general, but also very specific in as much as the particular groups who we're seeing are being affected by the decline significantly. So on an annual basis, we run a survey of last year 114,000 children and young people, looking at their reading habits and correlating them to attainment and other data. The decline in reading for pleasure is particularly affecting, first of all, key stage 3 and 4 children. So at key stage 2, 47% of children are reading for pleasure. When they get to key stage 3 and 4, it drops to 29%. The second characteristic is gender. So 39% of girls read for pleasure, whereas only 25.7% of boys do. So there's a gender change. But there's also, interestingly, a very specific geographic issue. At regional level, 39.5% of children in London read for pleasure, whereas in Yorkshire, only 28.6%. So it's, we're looking at a national challenge, but with very specific targets. And that's why the Year of Reading campaign has got particular targets around early years, around children, teenage boys, and around families from low socioeconomic backgrounds. Why this is happening is complex. The reading for pleasure is obviously a volitional action. You read for pleasure. It's effective and important because it's actually because you want to do it. And therefore, the inhibitors and the barriers to it are internal as well as external. So the sense for many young people, and this comes through from our research, that reading is more of a chore than a pleasure, which may reflect issues around pedagogy in schools. So the portrayal of something, this is a skill they have to acquire and test they have to pass, rather than something they wish to do. The issue of representation. So we know that actually one of the key things in terms of connecting with reading is seeing. There's a great quote in Shadowlands, you read to know you're not alone, which I think is very profound. But the sad fact is that 2 out of 5 children struggle to find people like themselves in books, and that's particularly true of children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and children from racially minoritized communities. So representation is, so there are external issues, internal issues, but there are also external issues, particularly around access to books and reading materials. 70% of teachers express concern that children don't have enough materials at home to sustain their reading activities. And we know that 1 in 10 children just don't have any books at home at all. So the issue about access to books is incredibly important. Remember also 1 in 7 primary schools don't have a library. But of course the other factor in terms of the decline, which is so well discussed, is the issues around the digital environment. And whilst undeniably the digital environment offers multiple distractions, has had impact on attention span, there are also elements of the digital environment which children do find conducive to reading. A lot of book talkers and a lot of the digital mechanisms and platforms actually support reading. And we know also that particularly teenage boys, the least likely to be reading for pleasure, actually find digital reading on a tablet and so forth very attractive, and can potentially be a way into, the research shows, more traditional forms of reading as well. So it's not one single factor, it's a number of factors.
Thank you very much. Annie Crombie.
So I agree with lots of what Jonathan has said, and I won't repeat his points. I think what I'd most like to add is in relation specifically to the early years and the reasons why we think it's challenging for children and families in the early years to establish that reading habit, which of course in the early years is so much about parental volition, engagement, confidence with reading, and of course we know that's super important, because if you establish a reading habit and you see yourself as a reader early on in the early years, we see that continues. Not only do you then reap further benefits down the line in terms of mental health educational outcomes that accrue later, but you also are more likely to continue reading as you get older. So that starting early is super important. And what we see there is not an entirely bleak picture. There are some things there which are really encouraging. So, for example, we see really strong levels of positivity about reading among parents. Kind of 95% of parents think it's important to read with your child, know that it's important to start early. We see that really strongly in our research. We also see that when parents do read with their child, they find it a positive experience. So most parents say that they enjoy reading to their child when they do it, and children also, and they say that they think that their child enjoys reading. So all of that is really positive. Where we see the challenge and the decline, if you like, is around the regularity of reading activity. So the number of children that have a daily reading routine, we think that that's about 50% and declining over the last period. There's some complexity in the data around COVID, which obviously for families played such an important role on kind of what their routines were like and what happened in family life. But we also see that even children reading frequently, so that's not a daily reading routine, but kind of maybe reading 4 times a week or so enough that it would feel like a kind of regular part of their life and a habit. We do also see that declining. What we see there is that there are probably 1 in 4 children who are not getting that regular that reasonable frequency of reading. And we see that when children start school, that kind of tapers off further. So there's a sort of, it holds up relatively well till about ages 3 and 4, and then we see that declining. And what we think that's about, I think we'll probably come on to a little bit more, but what I suppose just in very brief summary, there's certainly something about access to books, but there's a lot here about the kind of broader factors around family life. So they want to do it, but they are time poor, they are, it's particularly the case with families who struggle to establish a regular routine, which of course is more the case for families whose work patterns are complex, maybe they work shift work, or they factors, or they have complex kind of split families, so a number with different carers involved, that also makes it harder to establish a routine. So those kind of things which make which are really important in having that kind of regular rituals around bedtime stories or reading as a regular thing, and which also we tend to find we see structurally are more prevalent in families on lower incomes and with greater challenges, which is why we think there's that kind of greater we see slightly lower levels of reading activity among families on lower incomes. So it's a range of factors. There's a lot to do with parental confidence, but also to do with time. And I think I'll leave it there for now and pass on to Debbie.
Thank you. And I totally agree with my colleagues. We are facing a really complex set of challenges, and they're challenges which can't be solved really by one section of that reading ecosystem on its own. So it's not something schools alone can tackle. It needs a whole reading ecosystem to work together to tackle these challenges, because as we've heard, there are classroom and curriculum pressures which are part of the picture, alongside as well teachers' own confidence and skills in supporting reading for pleasure in the classroom. There are significant pressures, as we've heard, on children's leisure time. Our research with parents and children indicates the impact of after-school tiredness, pressures around homework, demands of extracurricular activity, as well as the demands, the distractions of TV, video games, and using digital devices. As Annie said, family reading is in decline. Families are not reading as much together. And parents tell us that they face a range of challenges to that family reading. But one of those key challenges is actually that adult reading is also in decline. So our annual State of the Reading Agency's annual State of the Nation research clearly shows that adults themselves are reading less. Just over half of UK adults now read for pleasure. That's a drop from 58% in 2015. Time and motivation are key factors, but we also mustn't forget that skills and confidence are also relevant. 1 in 6 adults don't read well and don't feel confident in reading with their children. So what this means is that children are not getting those formative family reading experiences that are so important to their development, and they're not seeing adults modelling reading, those positive reading behaviours. We know from research that 1 in 5 children who say that if they saw adults reading, that would encourage them to read more. So I think it's really important, as well as all of the other things that we've heard, that we consider adult reading as part of the equation if we're to break that cycle and ensure that those children have positive reading role models in schools and families. I think we also probably need to think about definitions of reading and the fact that they are changing, and we probably need to evolve the questions we ask about reading behaviours in order to fully understand the trends. So it's a complex issue, I think, a range of challenges there, and it does need an integrated response.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Chris.
Thank you. Jonathan, you touched upon this briefly, but I just wondered if you could drill down a bit more on particular groups of children where this is a larger challenge, and that's the whole panellists as well. And I declare an interest, I've got a particular interest in young carers, and I think that probably them finding the time to actually be able to read pleasure would be a particular challenge, but it's just whether there's any other groups that you think, and then put 2 questions together to save a bit of time, but also kind of why there's been decline in those groups. Some might be obvious, but just out of interest.
Yeah. As I say, the sharpest decline is associated with age, and we know that the digital lives of teenagers is an important factor in associated with that. We know, as I said earlier, that the gender is a key thing, and what the research shows quite clearly around that is that actually it's not an innately, there's nothing innate about the experience of reading for girls that is different to boys. However, girls from birth are more likely to be bought books as presents. Girls are more likely to be taken to the library. So the gendering of reading as an activity happens almost unconsciously at quite an early stage. The issue around regional variation, as I said, seems also to be linked to assets within those communities. So the cultural assets of London obviously significantly high. So a number of, and drilling down into specific groups, exactly as you say, such as young carers, you can see the way in which those factors interact. Young people whose lives are stretched, as Annie and Debbie were saying, the time associated, all of us have, the average amount of free time an adult has diminished by 25% over the past 5 years. All of us are time poor at the moment, and that is biting into it. But for those people who are particularly stretched, I think it's also worth bearing in mind that the foundation of all reading is speech, language, and communication. And what happens in the earliest years, exactly as Anya says, completely vital. That is absolutely bound up in experience of books, but it's also bound up in other things. High levels of cortisol in the first few years actually inhibit early language development. So the stress experienced in families with high levels of poverty actually. So all sorts of kind of factors combine to actually create the patterns that we're seeing.
And if I could just add to that a little, I think that like another group, for example, where we see lower levels of reading is children in particularly vulnerable family backgrounds. So children maybe in children in care, children in kinship care, children on the edge of care, and I think that is the kind of area where you can see both that there will be multiple different factors that make it hard to kind of establish regular reading. So the sort of dysregulated nature of the child's kind of emotional state or the family experience is all contributes to that. And then of course the other thing that we see really clearly is that like reading is such a I think it's kind of quite easy sometimes to sort of assume that families, I'm sure you don't, because that's why you're all looking into this so well, but so carefully. But families, it's easy to assume families know how to do it, that it's an obvious thing. And I think we can sometimes miss how deeply what a sort of deep Frank Cottrell Boyce Children's Laureate calls it invisible privilege, but this sort of way in which it is core cultural capital. It's really embedded in your family experience, and we see that really clearly in the research about intergenerational reading habits. So if you were read to as a child, you're much more likely to read to your children. You understand, you're likely to start earlier. So we see those kind of things, which then means that groups who have had kind of disrupted family circumstances are again likely to suffer from that kind of lack of intergenerational tradition and passing on of that kind of reading habit.
And to add to my colleagues, I would just say that there's another really important group that we mustn't forget about, and that's that group of children with who face specific reading challenges, who may have SEND needs, for them reading is not a pleasure. It can be a really difficult and demoralising experience. So I think we must really think when we're considering reading for pleasure interventions how we can include those children within mainstream activities so that they don't feel that they're a group on their own, that they can enjoy reading along with their peers, and that they can have those positive reading experiences that are about joy, not just learning to do the decoding.
And that leads on quite nicely to my next question, I think, actually, just about shared reading and whether there's the sort of similar trends in terms of the decline of shared reading, particularly in early years. And I think you kind of sort of touched on that a little bit there, Debbie, in terms of what the causes are of that. But is there anything the panel wants to add to that?
I mean, just that there is, but I think we should cling on to the, and start as well with the recognition that there is strong desire to shared reading seen as desirable, it's seen as a positive thing, and families enjoy it when they do it. And I think then kind of the unpicking of the causes around that are, complex, as we've said, but also I think take us into the territory of the people who introduce families who don't read to reading, the health visitors, the earliest childcare workers, the librarians and such, like in that kind of community early years system, who introduce families the opportunities that there are to do that, and some of the ways in which perhaps over the past kind of couple of decades we've seen some of those systems like less strong than perhaps they were.
I mean, yeah, just to follow up on that, so to declare an interest, I'm a fairly new father, and obviously have had health visitors, and they do come and talk to you about a lot of different things that you know that you it seems obvious, but you're like, oh, I didn't think of that. But I would say that you know, reading wasn't something necessarily that was really talked about. So would you say that that's something that would you would like to see?
Absolutely. And I mean, we know that 90%, so I fear you may have been in the 10%, but 90% of health visitors do introduce a family to reading with Book Start Baby. So they'll give a new family with a newborn baby a book, and when it works right well, and when the health visitor is confident and able to do that, they'll model reading. So they'll say, you can read to this child, this baby, even if they don't respond, these are the things that will be happening in their brain.
By the way, I wou't, don't worry.
I'm very pleased to hear it. Very pleased to hear it. But, you know, they do that, and we're pretty confident that happens in around 90% of cases. The degree of confidence with which the health visitor does that, whether they actually open the book and show how to do it and kind of help to build some of that confidence, that will be more variable. But those are the things that kind of are really key, and that can happen at that really, I mean, sort of 6-week check. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't happen until a year.
Thank you. Obviously, always happy to model that everybody needs some parenting advice, and we're happy to receive it on the committee. I'm going to bring Caroline Johnson in, and then I'll go to Serena.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask about two specific groups while we're on the groups that may not be reading as much. The first one was rural people who live in rural areas, perhaps a bit further from libraries and shops and such like. And also those in the coronavirus gap, so children who were in reception when the coronavirus pandemic hit. They're coming to are in year 6 now, I think, predominantly. And there were children who spent time at home with parents who weren't working and had lots more time than normal to read to them. But there were also children who were in households where things are much more chaotic as a result of not being at school. And so some of them were delayed in the onset of their reading and have struggled. Have you got any particular comment on either of those groups?
In terms of the rural issues, the National Literacy Trust works, as I said at the beginning, in 21 places in depth around the country. What's fascinating about those places is we've been working in those communities for over a decade now, and reading for pleasure levels, even though those are the most deprived wards in the country, are 20% higher than the national pattern. And they include Camborne and Redruth in Cornwall. They include some of the market town areas in Suffolk as well. And we've been looking quite tightly at what the challenges in those areas are not unique to those areas. The same, as both Annie and Debbie have said, what we're looking at is a system issue at community level. So the extent to which there is joined up and consistent and coherent provision and support for families and children, the extent to which the relationship between health and education is strong, the relationship between the levels of cultural provision and so forth is strong. Those factors play out in different ways, but they are the same factors in Cornwall and Suffolk as in Bradford and Stoke-on-Trent. In terms of, and are amenable to solution, that's the thing, they're not intractable. The coordination and that creation, it takes a village to raise a reading child. It's absolutely not impossible to crack it. In terms of the kind of the cohort born and experiencing early language development during the pandemic, the key thing there is the pandemic exacerbated the effect of socioeconomic disadvantage. So the mediating impact of access to public libraries, when public libraries were largely inaccessible for families, the mediating impact of early years provision, which kind of levels the playing field system, it was removed, and therefore the socioeconomic gap grew. And a lot of the work that's been going on has been very targeted at children who will have experienced the home learning environment is the key factor in all this. You know, the idea that actually it's what you do with a child at home, not who you are. You know, that is 4 times more impactful than the quality, the impact of even high quality education on the early development of a child. So actually, you know, supporting the children for whom the home learning environment in those early years was weak has been absolutely vital. So a lot of our work in terms of remedial support has been directed at children from those socioeconomic groups.
And sorry, go ahead.
So I was just going to add that, you know, in a practical context, we've found through our work with the Summer Reading Challenge that systematic outreach through cross-authority models and working with specialist partners, so connecting libraries with partners such as education, HAF, children's services and public health, has really enabled community interventions like the Summer Reading Challenge to reach into areas of disadvantage and low attainment and create new readers by attracting them into the library and into community activity. So using that cross-authority model has enabled us to reach over 150,000 new children and families in areas of low attainment for and disadvantage of various different kinds, and has really seen new families coming into community activity and into reading activity that may not have been involved in it before. The other thing I would add to that is that we've seen this has been particularly effective where libraries have given automatic library membership as part of sign up to the Summer Reading Challenge. So that means providing a library card in schools as part of their Summer Reading Challenge enrolment, and that has seen a huge increase in numbers of children coming into libraries and taking part in community activity who may not have done that before. So I think that's a sort of broad approach that has reached some of those groups that you're talking about.
Go to Serena next, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So let's further consider the reverse with decline in reading for pleasure. So based on your experience and evidence that you can draw on, what works to help stimulate and motivate children to read for pleasure? And I'll start with Jonathan.
So drawing on those communities which I'm talking about, there are several lessons we've learned. The first is that quick fixes don't work. This is a long-term system issue. So we've been working in those places for a decade. It's sustained activity. Because what we're doing is changing behaviour and motivation, not just addressing an attainment issue. The second thing we've learned is that it's not the job of any one agency. We've adopted a kind of tripartite model, working with local schools, colleges, nurseries, settings, libraries, vitally, but with also the community and voluntary sector, including the faith community in places like Bradford, which have got a key role to play in terms of parenting behaviour, and also with the local business community. So the role of employers, the role of brands, so important in terms of exciting and reaching families and redetermining what reading is for kids. And whether it's kind of, and that's also kind of important in terms of getting into the motivation issue, because working with the Premier League on reading is a way of engaging young boys. Working with McDonald's on family reading activity as a way to actually associate it with that extraordinary moment when you have your happy meal, not just kind of going into the library. So the role of brands and partnerships, the role of sustained impact, incredibly important. But so is the addressing that issue of access in practical ways. And that's why things like the Libraries for Primaries project, which we're working on at the moment, is crucially important. How we can actually ensure that that access to books isn't a postcode lottery, but is actually an entitlement. And that reading platform is there for all children.
Thank you, Jonathan. Annie?
So 2 elements to this that I think we need to think about separately when we are considering the solution. So the first bit is what motivates families, what engages families who aren't engaged, what can start a kind of positive intergenerational loop and help families to embed reading into their lives. And there we see multiple things which, as Jonathan says, need to come together and not a single fix any of them, but things like making reading feel more fun. So reading books in a way can be a blueprint for play. The best books that work best for the children in the early years are often involve, so they'll have interactive dialogue, they will have, they might have a mirror, they might have bits that move, they have flaps that create surprise. So all of these things which create a kind of wonderful, joyful, interactive experience. Families like reading when they see children responding positively to reading. So with a really young child, you can get handshaking or a face light up, and that is like a kind of, that is the most incredible, like, positive drug that kind of gets them wanting to do it again and again. And you see parents getting hooked on reading because they want that experience of a child smiling or laughing, or, you know, so those kind of things have to be part of reading for it to happen. Where it's more challenging, and then to sustain it, embed it again and again, we need things like books that are about real life, so that there are points of reference outside of the book for the things that are inside the book. You know, so if you think about the bear hunt and swishy swashy through the long grass, there's loads and loads of opportunities in there for the book to come to life outside of the reading experience, and then that kind of thing creates those onward points of references and brings back the family to the book, makes them feel like the book is part of their life, and reading's part of their life. So there's all of that kind of stuff. Other thing that we know is super important, and this is my other point, is that we've got to have, in order for families to start and feel they continue to build the confidence, they need to be introduced to it by a practitioner, a professional, another adult who can persuade them to give it a go, can show them that it is that it works like that. And we see in Bookstart, we see around 15% more families are likely to establish a reading routine where a practitioner models it and brings it to life, or gives them that sort of leg up. And so how we support all of the partners that we possibly can, come back to Jonathan's point about kind of multiple different people needing to be involved in order for us to get the best possible chance at this. But there are so many different touch points where it's possible, health visitors, GPs, etc., you know, even before we get into the more kind of traditional reading education library space. And so all of those being activated to give the best possible chance for families to have that moment where they see that it can give them that positive experience.
Thank you, Annie. And Debbie?
Well, I'd just add that, you know, like my colleagues have said, there are some blue skies. You know, we have examples like the Summer Reading Challenge, which consistently buck the trend. You know, we see 500,000 boys and girls reading over the summer, returning to school in the autumn, more confident readers. And what we've drawn from that evidence base of over 30 years of good practice is a what works for children's reading model, a reading for pleasure pedagogy. And this includes a number of key ingredients. So firstly, we find it's really important not to get hung up on how children are accessing reading, but rather to focus on the enjoyment and achievement a successful reading experience delivers, whatever the format and whatever the chosen content. Choice is absolutely vital. Without choice, reading loses its sparkle and becomes a chore, more like homework. So, really choice has to be at the heart of a reading for pleasure experience. But meaningful choice does require access to a broad range of content supported by expert signposting and curation. And libraries are amazing community reading assets in that sense. We also find that using the hook, not the book, into reading is a really successful strategy. So including interest pathways such as sport, music, STEM can offer really familiar entry points for reluctant readers. So this year's Summer Reading Challenge theme, for example, is Read to the Beat. It's got a music theme, and that's the starting point for all of the activation. As Annie said, representation and accessibility are key. Reading is a window on the world, but it's also a mirror. Children have to see themselves and their lives in the books that they're reading, and that content has to be accessible. So, for example, we always include books for children with dyslexia on our book lists, and that's really welcomed. We also feel activation is really important. Meaningful recognition of achievement, the motivation of positive reading role models, the encouragement of book chat and enrichment activities absolutely build communities of readers. And I think it's important to celebrate small steps. A magazine, a sports report, a comic, all counts in building a reading journey. But as Annie said, most importantly, reading has to be fun because enjoyment is key to becoming a reader for life. The Reading Agency's research shows that adults who enjoyed reading as a child are twice as more likely to be regular readers as adults. So it's a major building block on which to build.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.
Go to Caroline Bader. Can I just say we've got quite a few topics that we want to get your thoughts on. So I realise there's a lot to say, but I think if we're going to get through everything, we're going to have to be a little bit briefer in saying it, if that's okay. Caroline.
Thank you. So we've talked a lot about reading in the early years. I'd like to look at secondary school, because I think you said, Jonathan, that there's a noticeable dip when children go to secondary school. So perhaps you could talk a little bit about what best practice looks like in secondary schools to address the change, and how does it differ from best practice for younger children?
I think the big, in terms of what happens in schools, the big change between primary and secondary is that reading is everybody's business all the time in a primary school. And when you get to the secondary school, it may be the school librarian's job and the English department's job, but they are quite literature and perhaps might not be. So I think the building of a reading community in a secondary school which mirrors that of a primary school is a challenge. Absolutely, without a doubt, the best person to do that is the school librarian. They have the ability to work across the whole school community. They can take it out of being a subject area, and that should be backed up by a pedagogy which is around how each subject area teaches literacy. So literacy becomes, and reading becomes, the business of the entire school, and not simply an hour at lunchtime if you choose to go to the library, or something about Charles Dickens.
Annie?
I agree with all of that, and I won't add anything for the sake of time.
Evie?
I'll just add, building those foundations in primary is really important to moving into secondary, so that even if those distractions of secondary school take a child away from reading, it may be something that they come back to later. I'd just add that building connections between schools and communities are really important there. We did a 3-year project with NLT, which supported children in Islington over that transition between primary and secondary, connecting school and community. And what we found was we were able to maintain reading levels, whereas nationally they were dropping. And also I would just say our experience from the Summer Reading Challenge shows that if you give teenagers a reading leadership role, such as volunteering in the Summer Reading Challenge, that really helps to keep the motivation going.
Thank you.
Just a little bit more on secondary. So the government's announced as part of the curriculum assessment reforms that there will be a new screening test for reading around year 8. And I just wondered if you have thoughts about the link between competency in reading as a skill and reading for pleasure, whether there's a cohort of children who don't manage to secure the skill properly by year 6, who are perhaps currently being slightly forgotten by the time they get to secondary, at which point reading just becomes a difficult thing and we've lost the battle on reading for pleasure.
Absolutely. I mean, when you talk to adults who have low levels of literacy, the thing which they will all talk about is the moment when they develop the skills to mask that, and that's normally at the top of primary. I mean, I think the year 8 reading focus is welcome in as much as it is saying that reading is the business of the secondary school community, which is very, it's not done and dusted by the age of 11. It's something which, but the key thing also in terms of the reading for pleasure conversation is that because reading for pleasure is, as we're saying, a volitional act, it rests on your self-confidence as reader. And this is to be something not just you can do, but something you feel comfortable and confident in doing. So the key thing for that year reading 8 check is it builds pupils' confidence rather than undermines it.
And if I could just add to that, I think what we need to keep a really close eye on, though, is that we know that choice is so important. So children feeling they are choosing to be a reader is a really key part of developing a reading identity. So there is a risk around things that force and compel or kind of punish or have kind of, you know, negative consequences within a school system. And I think that's what we need to be mindful of if we want that to, and remember that once the functional literacy is there, the longer term, deeper benefits come from reading for pleasure and from seeing yourself as a reader and wanting to read. And that's, I think, an important thing to bear in mind.
So I just very quickly follow up. Do you think there's the sort of changes, the development of the English curriculum, do you think that's had any effect? The sort of, you know, we hear that children in primary school are having to learn what a fronted adverbial is, and you know, the way that literature exams are, there's less about loving the book and more about
Yes.
Yeah. I would say also that we've got to remember time, right? And a curriculum, in the same way that daily life is busy and there are many other things to focus on, so is that limited time. The more complex one makes the curriculum, in primary schools as well we see this, the more complexity there is around things like fronted adverbials, the less time there is
sit and enjoy
to focus on enjoying a book.
The conceptual divorce of reading for pleasure from literacy is a damaging thing for children. The two things need to be experienced together.
Thank you. Yep. I'm interested in this fronted adverbial and the interests of what's on the national curriculum that the lady brought up, because actually some schools are teaching the fronted adverbial because it's in state curriculum, but independent schools are not necessarily teaching what a fronted adverbial is. And it's perfectly possible to go right through your GCSEs and get a 9 in your English and English literature without having ever learnt what a fronted adverbial is. So why is there focus on teaching them at all? What's the point of it? What's useful about learning it?
I think that might be a question for the previous government that wrote that into the national curriculum, which schools are obliged to teach.
It's not a political point.
But that's where that was that big change in the curriculum, to have much more grammar content and to put children in a situation where they were being taught grammar that their parents wouldn't even necessarily recognise or understand came during those reforms. I
think the knowledge about language is actually a very important facet, and to have, you know, both culturally and academically and in terms of metacognition, to understand language and the way language works is really important. Pendulums can swing too far one way to get to the right place sometimes, and I think it's landing in the
and I think where we are now, what we need to be thinking about is particularly in early learning to read, is the balance probably between phonics teaching, time spent on phonics teaching, and time left for enjoying reading, storytelling in classrooms, supporting parents not just to do the phonics homework but also the reading for fun, to keep that reading habit going when a child starts school if they've had one embedded previously, and not to think, oh, now the child's learning to read, it's just all about zig and zog, and you know, that's the only content that needs to be in our reading. So I think that's probably where, you know, we slightly kind of caricature with the fronted adverbial, but I think there is still kind of that issue around that balance between phonics and reading for fun.
I suppose it depends which way you go into it, whether you teach the grammar first and then the reading comes after, or whether the grammar comes as a result of the reading. And the reading for pleasure, which, you know, we know supports the development of literacy skills. So, you know, you have to have the interest and the passion to pick up the technical aspects.
Use that and then
Really helpful. Thank you. We'll go to Mark.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just drilling down now into the major initiatives designed to encourage reading. You've already referenced it, but the Department for Education launched the National Year of Reading this year. We're 2 months in. That's 17% if you round up done. What are the objectives of the National Year of Reading? How can we make sure that it is a success? This is open to anyone.
Start, Jonathan.
Can I start? Because we're supposed to be leading it. Yeah. So, I mean, the objective of the Year of Reading is to redefine reading for contemporary society, to engage the whole nation in the action of reading, but particularly focused on those people who aren't reading at the moment. There are kind of 3 pillars of activity. The first is social marketing, getting the message across, utilising brands, utilising social media, utilising influences, get the message across that reading is relevant, exciting, and something which you want to be associated with regardless of your background. And the second element is very much around what's happening in schools, the kind of conversations we're having at the moment, and how teachers can be supported in the promotion of reading. And the third element is actually the activation of communities. So far, in terms of the campaign element, we've seen huge traction in terms of social media, which is great. Schools have entered into it in the most fantastic way. 5,000 schools have registered for free CPD around reading for pleasure. That's over a quarter of schools in the country have already taken part in it. There was an first online event for children for the National Year of Reading a couple of weeks ago. 580,000 children, over 500,000 children took part. We're anticipating the event on World Book Day would engage over 1 million children. So there's a strong sense that the Year of Reading is happening in schools, happening in the social space, but also in communities. So the Reading Agency is coordinating an amazing programme across libraries. The Booktrust is doing fantastic things across the early years sector. But we've also asked local authorities to register their strategic interest and commitment to the aims of the Year of Reading. And of English authorities, 90, so going on for 2/3 have already registered their strategic commitment to the Year of Reading as well. And 16,000 community volunteers have been recruited so far as well. So 2 months in, it's kind of the foundation's been laid.
Brilliant. And just before I bring Annie and Debbie in, and feel free to answer this follow-up question too, the previous National Year of Reading, they took place in 1998 and 2008.
Yes.
How effective were they? And have we learned any lessons from them to make sure that this one has long-term impact?
That's a brilliant question. The first Year of Reading was, say, 98, and it was launched to complement the literacy strategy announcement that Blanket announced. And the idea was very much, it was a social campaign around social engagement with reading, and it was a phenomenal celebration. The second one was at the tail end of the strategy period, and there were groups who hadn't responded to the literacy and the primary and the secondary strategies, and so they were isolated. And again, as with the first strategy, it was first Year of Reading. It was basically a social activity, but with much more of a kind of social marketing focus on those target groups.
Okay.
This year, what we want to do is not simply look at social marketing, as I say, but actually look at the system around reading, make sure that local authorities, make sure that schools begin to change. Everything you've heard from each of us has been around the fact that that people's reading activities take place in a cultural, academic and social constructs. We want to change through the Year of Reading those constructs. Now, we can't do it in 1 year. We can lay the foundations for 1 year, but what we can do is begin to initiate those bigger system changes.
Thank you very much. I'll bring in Annie and Debbie for any additional comments.
I won't add all that much, but I suppose just to say that I think the kind of general halo effect of a particular all system focus on reading is really welcome. I think what we've talked about previously, you can see that all of the things that we're trying to do rely on reading not being within a kind of particular narrow swim lane of activity, about it being kind of outside of its literacy straitjacket, if I can dramatise a little bit. It needs to be held and understood and it by multiple different partners for early years reading to be embedded, for example. So that is really welcome, but I think that the sustainability of it and of that sort of focus is key. And I think campaigns are of a certain amount of value in raising the overall kind of dialogue and debate around reading, but the real thing that matters is that kind of longer term, slower burn embedding of activity within communities and networks, which is going to be the key to any kind of longer term success and making the investment worthwhile.
And I would just add that I think we're in a different place now to when we've all, Jonathan and I and Annie have all done the other 2 years of reading, and I think we're now much more able to work together as a whole reading ecosystem, and I think the National Year of Reading is providing a really important opportunity to connect us all around shared aims and priority groups, which I think is really a move on from previous years of reading. But I absolutely reinforce Annie's point about you know, to be successful, what we do need to do is build on the best practice of what we know works. We can't create anything new in this year because the resource is not sufficient. I mean, you know, it is good resource there, but, you know, the best way of investing that resource is to invest it in the amplification of best practice and programs that we know work and have the opportunity to be amplified and grown. So, you know, we're really looking forward to seeing how legacy of the year can build on that, how we can build programmes such as the Summer Reading Challenge as part of the legacy of the National Year of Reading.
Thank you very much. Time's short, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you. We'll go to Dan. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Staying with the idea of big reading initiatives, obviously we're all looking forward to World Book Day this Thursday. The chair of the committee is leading a debate on this in Parliament. And the Summer Reading Challenge, I know, is something that always is a big hit in my constituency and beyond. But I'm just interested in how effective these kinds of initiatives can be in developing that lasting enjoyment of reading among children.
I mean, they have to be built on something. There has to be something for them to activate. I think that's kind of the key thing I say. And then I think they can have an incredibly valuable role. So, you know, what we see, because I guess the Children's Laureate would be another one, and what we see through that, for example, is that the Children's Laureate can create a real sense of like, do you know, of like buzz and excitement, a little bit of stardust. There is something about reading which is a little, and reading aloud as well, you know, there is the sort of the showmanship, the sort of special occasion, and then that's a factor. It makes partners working on the ground day to day in libraries, or people who are associated with reading see it part of their daily job. It makes them feel that they're part of something bigger, that it's part of, you know, that there's something special there. That's great, but you have to have that. You have to have those networks, understanding people working on the ground with families, understanding what those broader benefits of reading are and why it matters so much, in order for those things to have that kind of impact.
A quarter of children on free school meals say the first book they owned came as a result of World Book Day £1 book tokens. These moments have immense value in themselves, but as has been said, their strategic value is if they're embedded in what the school is doing and in a wider infrastructure of reading activity.
And I would just add that programmes such as World Book Night and Summer Reading Challenge aren't necessarily just one-off events. Summer Reading Challenge takes place over 3 months each year. It's scaffolded by engagement points like the Winter Mini Challenge as a follow-on. It connects schools in the summer and the autumn term, and you know those benefits extend well into those school years. And you know it absolutely happens at scale. So we run 20,000 library events over that summer period, attracting 600,000 attendees, and that's delivering a real impact on children's reading, enjoyment and attainment, and they come back year after year. So and it's having a major impact on library loans. You know, we're seeing that book loans over that summer period, 18% of those book loans, of library book loans over the year, are as a result of the Summer Reading Challenge, and it engenders 100,000 new library members who continue to be library members and continue to use the library. So I would say that they're not one-off events, they're part of an annual and ongoing programme of reading for pleasure activity.
Okay, thank you. And for you specifically, Debbie, some academics have suggested that extrinsic factors, rewards, challenges, that kind of thing, are not always effective at developing that long-term enjoyment of reading. Now, as a former academic, sometimes we're right, sometimes we're completely wrong.
Okay.
So what's your response to what they're suggesting? And how do you ensure that, for example, the Summer Reading Challenge genuinely motivates children to really enjoy reading?
Okay. I think where there are barriers and challenges to reading, it's unrealistic to think that intrinsic motivation is going to be the sole solution to tackling that decline. Meaningful activation and acknowledgement is key to supporting less confident readers to engage, and also more confident readers to stretch. So it's about the fun, it's about setting personalised goals, it's about making reading enjoyable and achievable. And our evidence really does show that extrinsic motivation has a place in supporting reading engagement. Our annual survey and independent studies show that summer reading and challenge incentives, such as the medals and the certificates, are not just valued for themselves, but are also key mechanisms supporting children to become readers, giving them a sense of accomplishment. And they're also part of a much wider activation package that includes choice and agency, responsive adult engagement, and enrichment activities. And for many children who take part, we see that those extrinsic motivators actually lead to intrinsic motivation. Yeah. So I absolutely feel that there is a place, there's a proven place for intrinsic motivators in supporting reading for pleasure, especially for more reluctant readers.
That's really helpful, thank you.
Can I just ask really briefly about World Book Day? So World Book Day is great fun. It is a kind of, wonderful national moment, but it is also it places quite a responsibility on parents and families. And there are families who have greater resources than others in their ability to source a costume and kind of, enable their child to participate. And I just wondered whether any of you've got any comments to make on the extent to which that there's a disadvantage kind of issue with the kind of responsibility that it places on family, the 1 in 10 families who don't have a book at all at home, for example, to enable their children to participate in what is, undoubtedly a kind of great annual moment.
I mean, I think many schools are incredibly sensitive to that and are taking away the narrative around dressing up on World Book Day. Mm-hmm. And I think that is by far, I think the sensitivity to that narrative is and schools are proactively dealing with that.
Yeah. We see that too a lot, introducing costume swaps or making items to dress up with in a school art lesson. So there are ways around it. But it is, as you say, incredibly important because otherwise it risks exacerbating the factors that we know around kind of stresses on home life, which are getting in the way of reading being embedded in the first place. So you're right.
The whole point of this is that reading for pleasure is a driver of social mobility. Children who read for pleasure by the age of 15 more likely, it's a stronger determinant of their ultimate attainment than their socioeconomic background. So therefore, anything which takes away from it being not simply a driver of social mobility, but actually an anti-poverty strategy, is actually undermining the power of reading for pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. And we'll get to Manuela. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. I want to talk a little bit more about the role of Children's Laureate that Annie mentioned. What has been the impact of the post of the Children's Laureate on encouraging different groups of children to read for pleasure?
Thank you for the question. And the Children's Laureate is managed by Booktrust, but on behalf of the wider sector. So my colleagues may want to add, but I think that some things about the design of it. So the way that the Children's Laureate works, they hold the post for 2 years. Each one of them chooses a different particular focus. So we saw Cressida Cowell focusing very much on libraries, being moved on through the work on libraries for primaries, and that's maintained its resonance in the system. Frank Cottrell Boyce currently very much focused on early shared reading and on the community partners who come together in different parts of the country to create a kind of a community storytelling ecosystem. So I think that what all of those have in common, in terms of the sort of more direct answer to your question, is that they all bring some of that stardust. They all bring a particular focus. They act to open doors, and they unite people from diverse sectors. So kind of Frank Cottrell Boyce is going to speak at the National Association of Virtual School Heads in a few days' time. So to talk to them about the role that reading can play for children from the most vulnerable backgrounds and why it can be so helpful in helping children to explore and understand their identity. So, and he can bring that kind of that bit of his sort of, I suppose, his celebrity, his different way of looking at the world, and communicate to a different audience. And I think it's through that kind of activity that we can see the Children's Laureate having one of its greatest impacts.
And I would just add that anything that provides a positive adult reading role model for children has to be a good thing. It brings profile and advocacy, and just sets a really good example.
Can I just ask, has there been any independent evaluation of the impact of this role?
Of the Children's Laureate, no.
No.
It's supported by publishing. It's supported by the wider sector. There's evaluation of kind of ambassadorial roles generally, which I think help us to see how role models and people from different backgrounds can help when, together with other things, resonate, help the focus of their attention to resonate with different groups. So certainly role models helping to cut through to different parts of the community that we're all trying to reach, but not of the Children's Laureate as a specific programme.
So we don't know like how much, what is the, if there is outcome in reading groups because of the Children's Laureate, because of strategies that teachers have adopted, for example, within their school, or a new library set up in a school, because we don't know that.
Well, we do in relation to the different Children's Laureates. So in relation to, for example, Cressida Cowell, while Children's Laureate, she set up a number of libraries in different schools. Yes. Exactly to your point, we then saw that model and the kind of key things that she was campaigning for within her laureateship taken on. So we could kind of map through but I think because the focus of each laureate is so specific, we have to look at it laureate by laureate in terms of the specific outcomes that we would see from each one.
Thank you for clarifying. So my last question to the panel: what are your main recommendations to government as to what actions they could take to reverse the decline of reading for pleasure? And I can start with Jonathan.
Okay, so I think what we've all been saying is that there is a need to amplify, make coherent, elevate the great things that are going on, and that's what the Year of Reading is about. My call is that the Year of Reading is actually turned into a decade of reading to actually sustain the foundations that are being laid, the partnerships that are being created this year, and to sustain momentum. I think the second thing I would suggest is that the Libraries for Primaries initiative, within the next 3 years, will have put a library in every primary school that previously didn't have one. It needs to be extended. It needs to be extended to secondary schools, because a similar number of secondary schools don't have libraries. And as in the primary space, it needs to include the training of librarians as well for those spaces. And both elements need to be sustained. So the second recommendation would be a universal commitment to school library provision. And my third would be reading action zones. We know that the distribution of reading patterns in the country are not equal. There are places where communities in Middlesbrough where 40% of the adult population are functionally illiterate, where we need to drive deeper and work in different ways, and bringing all the resources we can to bear in those communities, I feel, is very important.
Thank you.
So I focus on the early years because I think that's such an important area for government to focus on, and where it can make so much difference in terms of long-term reading for pleasure. And I think the thing that government could do is to put reading right at the heart of its vision for early childhood. So reading is, I think, seen too narrowly. It's seen too much as a sort of very kind of school readiness focus in the early years that sets children on the pathway to literacy. Of course, that's important. We've been talking about that today. But it's so much broader than that. And the relational benefits of reading, the benefits in terms of like empathy, mental health and such like, will only be realised if it is more broadly embedded across the early years. So that is what Bookstart does, and I think that the government could leverage that more, and the other initiatives that are built on that as part of its kind of cross-government, multi-agency approach to early years services. So that's where I kind of put my greatest focus.
We would advocate for a joined-up approach in policy funding and practice across government departments, so we're better connecting the dots between schools, families and communities to create that holistic reading journey. We would recommend support for linked adult reading interventions to address those root causes of inequality, but also to strengthen reading role models for children in classrooms and in families. And finally, we would advocate for investment in best practice interventions to add capacity to schools, to make sure that there's work in the community that adds that richness of the offer. Programmes such as the Summer Reading Challenge really complement the school's offer but are non-statutory and vulnerable to diminishing library budgets. So, investment in programmes such as that would be a game changer in universalising those programmes and making sure more children had access to them.
Thank you very much. Can I thank all of you for coming to give your evidence today? It's been a really fascinating session. If we have been short on time, we always are short on time. If there's anything that you didn't feel that you managed to convey to us, or anything that you think afterwards you wish that you'd said, please do feel free to write to the committee, and we'd really welcome that. But for now, thank you very much for your evidence.
Thank you.
Of the Education Select Committee oral evidence session on reading for pleasure this morning. Can I invite our second set of witnesses to introduce yourselves to us this morning, starting with Onyinye Iwu.
Thank you. I am Onyinye Iwu. I am a Black British author and illustrator, working with several publishers, creating diverse books, and I am also a secondary school art teacher and design technology teacher. I also run specific courses and electives on writing and illustrating comic strips with Key Stage 3 students. And I'm also working with the other groups of authors and illustrators on promoting author visits to schools, especially that haven't actually received author visits before, because we think that's really important.
Thank you very much. Anjali, Patel.
Hi there, I'm Anjali Patel. I'm lead advisory teacher at the Centre for Literacy in Primary Education, or CLPE. We're a literacy charity and an English association, so we support primary school teachers and leaders to develop effective and engaging and evidence-based language and literacy provision. Our core value is that it's every child's right to be literate, and to be literate you need to have access to high quality texts and book sharing experiences with interested adults and peers. We work with hundreds of primary schools and we serve thousands of member teachers. We're able to research and explore what we know works in early years and primary school classrooms, and particularly we have associate schools across the country working in educationally vulnerable and disadvantaged communities with children who may be working in areas of adult illiteracy, coastal rural schools, I heard that earlier, and we do have mainly mainstream, but we do work with some schools with alternative provision and SEND. And we have designed over the 50 years of our life of the charity a book-based English curriculum which supports children to read and write for pleasure and puts reading for pleasure at the heart of the curriculum. So that's my main area.
Thank you very much. Luke Taylor.
Hi, I'm Luke. I'm a senior researcher at the think tank, the Centre for Social Justice. My main focus of work is on our Lost Boys project, so we've been doing this for the last few years. And within that we have looked at reading and what we can do there.
Thank you. Ellen Broomé.
Hi, I'm Ellen. I'm the Chief Executive of British Dyslexia Association. We're the national charity working to make sure that children, young people and adults with dyslexia are able to thrive.
Thank you very much indeed. So we have heard a lot of evidence about the decline in reading for pleasure amongst children and young people. What is your assessment of the current state of reading for pleasure amongst the specific groups of children that you focus on in your work? And I might start with Ellen this time round.
Yeah, so thank you so much, and I'm really delighted to be giving evidence to the inquiry. I think it's really important, and as a self-declared lover of reading, I want to make one kind of, I suppose, central point. If we're really serious about reading for pleasure and the importance of reading for pleasure for children and young people, that we really must work harder at addressing the barriers faced by dyslexic children. For very many dyslexic children, reading is not enjoyable. It is difficult, exhausting, and something that they avoid, and that's what children and families tell us every single day, and the teachers that teach them as well. So reading for pleasure depends on confidence, on fluency, on enjoyment, but for many it's really hard. So they spend a lot of time decoding words on a page and not really enjoying the content. And I think as a result of that, too many dyslexic children and young people disengage from reading really quite early on, and they have quite a heavy backpack of educational failure or feelings of failure and embarrassment and stigma around their reading. And I think that's something that we really need to try and address, and I'm happy to expand on that, and I'm sure there'll be opportunities for that later on as well.
Great. Thank you, Luke Taylor.
So a few things. I think a lot of them were discussed previously. Certainly parenting is quite high up there. If we can get parents who are reading to their children every day, it has a massive impact. We can see that in the data in terms of how far behind or ahead kids are, whether they're read to regularly. I think also I'd really highlight smartphones, technology as a major inhibitor. I know they're a tool as well, but I mean, just in my own personal life, when I got a flip phone, I read more. When I got Netflix, I read less. But we also know from some of our data that there are 814,000 kids aged 3 to 5 who now have social media accounts. 25% of kids who are between the age of 5 and 7 also have their own smartphone. So we can't ignore that technology has basically seeped into the lives of everyone without it being regulated. And actually, I think I can speak for older people, without it being modelled too well in terms of, we know that one of the best buffers for kids being good with their own use is whether their parents show them what good use is, and we all probably go on them far too much. I think there's a couple of other things, maybe slightly more specifically to boys, because those are certainly on both. One would be boys. Actually, it's quite hard to see men reading nowadays. I think two big reasons for that is we know there are 2.5 million children in the UK who don't have a father figure at home. So it's quite hard for them, obviously, to see their father reading at home. But also we know that there's a very gendered teaching workforce. So if you're in primary school, 15% of teachers are men. You go to secondary school, it's a third. So it does go up, but not very high. If boys don't see men reading, they might not perceive that to be an activity that they want to do or something that is masculine. And I think if we can, I'll come on to solutions later, but that obviously has to play into it. Two other quick things. The previous panel spoke about special educational needs, things like speech, language and communication, and how that can play into making reading harder. Through our research, we found that 60% of special educational needs kids are boys. Likewise, if you have EHCP, 70% of them are boys. So it is likely that you will have, part of the reason boys are less likely to is because they are much more likely to be in those categories in the first place. And then I think finally that again, like they mentioned in the last panel, it is quite a gendered activity, even from a young age. So whether or not, if we want to deal with why boys are reading less, I think if we can make it feel more open to masculine traits, more of a thing that is boy-friendly, that should go quite a long way, because potentially we've gone too far the other, and boys don't feel like it's a space that is for them.
Anjali?
I think, firstly, just thinking about being a reader and children and adults that are literate and identify as being readers, you need to have that competency, the confidence to apply your knowledge, your skills to the process, but you've also got to have that willingness to practice, because it's difficult and it's fairly new in terms of brain development. They need to practice, they need to refine, they need to develop the skills. And I think if we work backwards, to have that reader identity, you need to see the benefit, you need to recognise the value, To do that, you need the pleasure of it. You need to enjoy reading, which is what we're talking about today. To do that, you need to be proficient. You need it not to be as much of a struggle. So you need that ability. And to get there, you need that motivation. And we were talking about that extrinsic and the intrinsic motivation. And you also need that connection. So we know that at CLPE because we have our literacy library. It's a teacher reference library at the centre of our building, where we can make those recommendations to teachers or online. And we know that children are affected as readers by the social, the environmental factors, but also by educational policy. If we want to teach children to read confidently and volitionally, it does require teachers to know about, build on and develop a wide range of experiences. They need to build on children's own experiences and understand those. They need to show them the knowledge required in being a reader, the behaviours, as well as the skills and strategies, of course. But crucially, they need to build those positive attitudes towards reading. And what we have at the moment is really a moment to just ask ourselves if what we're doing is working. Why are we having why have we got a crisis in reading for pleasure? Because what we need to do in schools is teach children to read, not just knowing how to do it, but why they're doing it and wanting to do it. So we need to ask ourselves whether the teaching and assessment of reading based on what teachers are told to do, what's in place for them in terms of the policy, the curriculum, how that affects our most educationally vulnerable children who haven't perhaps had what we would think of as those foundational experiences from birth in being a reader. You don't start to learn to read in reception through a phonics program. You start to learn to read from birth, as we know. And if you look at the most literate children and adults, they have had a journey from birth that's enabled them to do that. And every single child we have a responsibility to make sure every single child should access that. So our job, I suppose, is to be thinking about the curriculum, the balanced approach to teaching reading that allows those attitudes, the knowledge, the skills and the behaviours to develop alongside one element of it. It's been skewed a little, I think, towards the skills, and calling that foundational sort of negates everything else that we would consider to be foundational for readers.
Thank you. Onyinye.
So as a teacher, for me, I see the struggles, especially between Key Stage 3 and 4, of students actually engaging with reading. We have, over the years, there's been many pedagogical initiatives that have been embedded within the curriculum throughout the day. One that I've seen in several schools is DEAR, which is Drop Everything and Read, and students are encouraged to bring a book every day from the library or from home to read. But the struggles that I see on a daily basis of students just literally be like, this is boring, why do I have to do this? I 100% agree with the idea of sort of reading being quite gendered at the moment. Boys specifically feel like sort of alienated from this, and it's very obvious, like, there's no effort to actually, go and get a book. A lot of students basically don't really enter the library, even if they do have a library in school. And it's about kind of making that change, like what is going to be incentivizing you to actually go there. Coming from sort of my background and sort of looking into representation, I personally came from a low-income background, and for me, representation wasn't there in books. However, because I needed that escape, I needed to read, and reading opened up a lot of opportunities, not just sort of academically, but also gave me that opportunity to sort of see different words, like we're talking about mirrors and windows. And I think that's really important because where there is a lot of students that don't have access to books at home, don't have access to maybe local libraries, and where reading is sort of not enforced as part of the sort of general family culture, you do have a sort of, uselessness of reading. It's like, oh, why do I have to read? I just have to do my GCSEs and that's it. So it's really important, specifically where it comes to students from, disadvantaged backgrounds, to try and improve the reading for pleasure. A lot of communities don't encourage children to read for pleasure. They focus on sort of textbooks. You have to study for your exams. You don't have to read for pleasure because that's not going to get you a job. And coming from a migrant background, that's kind of the thing that you consistently hear. So it's something that needs to change intrinsically also in families as well as in schools. Completely agree with Luke with social media. I told my students I was coming here and I told them, guys, you know, why do you guys not read? And a lot of them is like, Miss, but we have TikTok. What's the point? And that is it. You've got TikTok, you've got Netflix, you've got the film coming out. Why would you read the book? So it's about understanding what's going to draw the students to actually reading. And also, I'm also an illustrator and author, and I think part of it is a lack of diversity where it comes to the production of books. But one of the most important things is the lack of marketing, because there are so many diverse books out there, but they don't reach the people that they need to reach. So, you know, you have plentiful stories that are, you know, showing mirrors into maybe disadvantaged backgrounds, but students don't know about them. So they're like, oh, I can't relate to all these things. They have nothing to do with me, but the stories are out there. But unfortunately, they are not reaching the right students. So, yeah.
You just say a little bit, and we will need to be mindful of time again this morning, about, in your experience as an author and illustrator, how has the world of children's books changed over the last couple of decades?
So I believe that we have definitely done a big jump forward where it comes to actual diverse books, diverse characters, diverse stories, diverse realities. However, the thing that I consistently see is that we are highlighting the same authors within the shops, to an extent even within the schools and the libraries, because that's kind of what we're comfortable with. You know, where it comes to the curriculum, I know over the years the curriculum has changed, and some schools have more I guess they can sort of choose some of the books that they can show their students, maybe not where it comes to GCSE, but there is a little bit more leeway. But I do think that we need a little bit more structure where it comes to making sure that there is support for creators of diverse books that are able to actually maintain careers to actually do this, because if you don't have the creators that do create this work, we won't be able to have the books and the students won't be able to see them. And when I'm talking about diversity, I'm not talking about just racial diversity, I'm talking about working class, I'm talking about gender, I'm talking about just making sure that we are creating windows to every experience out there, which I think at the moment is not happening, because I mean, I'm sitting here as an author illustrator as well as a secondary school teacher that works full time. And having the time to be able to actually do everything is extremely difficult. And there are so many people like me in my situation that want to create these diverse stories, but find it difficult to actually support themselves financially. And so there need to be things put in place to make sure that we can do this, because if I don't have a privileged background that would allow me to just kind of be a creative, because the publishing industry doesn't pay that much. So I need to make sure that I'm able to sustain myself financially. So how do I do that? And to have that diversity, especially where it comes to, you know, people from maybe less privileged backgrounds, we do need to put financial support behind it.
Thank you. We'll go to Chris.
Yeah, thank you. And you mentioned about we're talking about representation, and you sort of mentioned that sometimes the representation is out there. It's just that we're not aware of it, which I think was really interesting. So, which is something I hadn't actually considered. But I just wondered if you, or the panel in general, can touch upon whether there are still some groups that are underrepresented in literature, which I'm sure there are, and kind of which particular groups of children this is particularly important. I think you touched upon sort of low-income families, which I think is really important. It is absolutely really important, and kind of the impact that has, and just any of the panel really touching on.
Yeah, I mean, like I said before, I think for me, obviously I took her as a black woman, but I would see it as any ethnic minorities, and also, again, I repeat, boys. I have 2 sons, and I know that my aim is to actually create books for them, because I do see that a lot of the characters and a lot of the stories maybe don't carry that sort of reality of life for boys. There is a lot of focus on, I think with time, because people have sort of stayed away from race, a lot of the characters are now more animals. And so when you now focus on animals, that means that you are removing the real life sort of characters and what happens today in somebody's life. And so I think it's very important, especially for ethnic minorities, to see themselves, to feel like they can be part of the conversation. They can be part of literature and they can be part of art, because that is something that makes you feel like you're part of the society. And for a lot of us, I do feel like, especially growing up, we have kind of sort of like a bit of a segregated element, in our mind. When you read, you don't really read about yourself. You don't, Peckham is not part of the conversation type of thing. So it's important that everybody can sort of see themselves, and also actually everybody can see everybody else, because it's about making sure that if we are really trying to create a multicultural society, then we need to be accepting, and to be accepting we need to know everybody's experiences.
I like your phrase, windows and mirrors. I thought that was very good.
I would really add to that around children with special educational needs and disabilities. I don't think they are well represented in children or young people's books, and I think that it is really hard for them to see themselves in books, and therefore part of that creating a reader identity and who am I, and can I be a reader even if I have this disability or that particular condition. And I think that's really, really important to sort of think around disability inclusion, actually.
Can I just, CLPE produces an annual survey called Reflecting Realities, which is now in its, we're working on our 9th one right now, and that's where we ask publishers to send any books that they publish that have that feature racially minoritized or characters of colour. And in the first year of that, which I think it was 2017, we looked at those books. Given that there are 10,000 or so books published for children every year, only 4% of the books published in 2017 featured a racially minoritized character. I'm saying racially minoritized because when you're marginalized or erased, you are minoritized. Only 1% of the titles, and this was 8 years ago, featured a racially minoritized protagonist or main character. Now that really, really matters, because when we're talking about what I've just talked about in terms of connection, you need to have connection to the reading material. You need to see yourselves. And Dr. Rudine Sims-Bishop has that wonderful windows, mirrors and sliding doors. You need to be able to see out. It's a social justice issue, especially at the moment, to see yourself. And you need to see yourself as part of what you are doing. There has been a steady rise. We work really closely with publishers to make sure that there's increased output and volume. We also want to make sure that they're high quality representations. If you haven't read Onyinye's books, they're amazing. Joel particularly loved that. But there has been, it's improved year on year to about 30%, so it's not quite yet at where we're at in terms of the child population. But there was a really worrying drop last year, the year before last actually, to 17%, and it's increased to 24%, so it hasn't got back to where it was, and a lot of that is to do anecdotally. We're hearing from creators of colour, and we've got, we work with Booktrust on that in terms of making sure that we can highlight and spotlight up and coming authors, poets and illustrators, and as well as thinking about internship. That's how we work, so that we get people that can work then within the publishing industry. At the moment, in 2021, so it's the 5th survey, there was quite a lot of output with picture books and things like that. We look at non-fiction and middle grade, but in 2021, we increased the number of Black British characters and figures, which was wonderful. So we've got that British narrative, but only 4% of the main cast characters in the 5th survey were of South Asian heritage. East Asian heritage characters are also falling behind. We have seen those incremental gains in those main characters. We're using the census data, which is a bit reductionist, but we need that for comparison. There are the highest proportion of presence now is Asian and black. However, quite a few of the characters at the moment are coded as black rather than black Caribbean, black African, which is flattening the black experience. So we're constantly having that dialogue, and we use the data to be able to talk to that. But primarily, our aim of doing this is so that we can have more books from which to choose and then recommend to teachers so that they can increase and make more representative their book stock and the books that are at the centre of the curriculum. You can feasibly get through the national curriculum and the texts that are advised and recommended types of texts, fairy tales, whatever it might be. You could really just get to Key Stage 4 without seeing yourself at all represented, not only in the book stock but in the curriculum, until you meet perhaps problematic and stereotyped characters, or you could be marginalised in traditional tales, and that's why we do it. You have to be at the centre of what you're reading.
Thank you. Aaron.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. The question I was planning to ask, I think, has been answered. It was really just to get your sense of the state of ethnic representation in children's books and that inclusion of diversity and so on. So I think to a large extent you've covered that. What I would then ask just briefly, Onyinye and Anjali in particular from your work, what do you think needs to happen in the future to keep it on the right trajectory? And what are your thoughts on the curriculum and assessment review where there has been a recognition that actually the English literature curriculum needs to look like modern Britain, not like, you know, the 1950s grammar school it had become before? So what are your thoughts on that? Maybe Onyinye, if you begin.
I think what needs to happen is...
It's fine, we can
Sorry,
carry on.
I thought it was me. Okay. I know. So I think what needs to happen is, I noticed the dip even before the report came, and personally I felt like it was very reactive. It was like, you know, a lot of things happened in 2020, everybody kind of got really excited, oh yeah, let's get some diverse books out. And kind of it boomed, and then suddenly it's like, okay, back to normal. And so it's about reducing the reactiveness, and like you said, it's like representing what is actually our society and what are our communities. Like I said, as a creator, it's important that we support the creators. It's important that we recognize the fact that it's not just about having black characters there, but it's about authentic black characters, like you said. Different cultures like African, Caribbean, South Asian. It's important to make sure that we are able to create this without straining ourselves. There are so many people over the years that I have seen start this career and then stop because they financially just couldn't. And so kind of that's the first bit. Where it comes to the curriculum, there are so many schools that have the opportunities to introduce their students to more modern and diverse books. I think is about maybe getting into those schools, and that's why some initiatives like the Great British School Tour, what we're trying to do is actually getting into schools as illustrators and authors and actually showcasing what we do. Children that have author visits are going to be reading more, they are going to be more engaged in what they're doing, and diverse, yes, but generally also actually seeing what it looks like in real life and what it looks like in page. So I think it's more presence as creators in schools, and I mean it all starts with funding with us to make sure that we're actually able to do the things that we're trying to do.
Can I just ask a quick supplementary? So is there a difference between what you're measuring in terms of new output and new publications every year and the extent to which a diverse range of books are really becoming embedded in the canon that is available to every child? Like there's a difference, right? Like it's important what's being produced and who's getting published, but it's also important what are the kind of top 10 children's books that we all think of as the most amazing children's books for different ages, and whether there is diverse representation there. I'm sorry to ask a supplemental because we are struggling on time, so I do need to ask you to be brief.
So obviously through our curriculum, part of the reason we did this is we wanted to be able to put those books into the curriculum to advise our schools to do that. We still find that with the time-stretched teaching community and beleaguered teaching community, they will often, and totally understandably, certainly in primary sector, they're teaching 11 subjects, they need to just teach what they know. So it's really about encouraging and supporting teachers to bring those texts at that level from early years onwards into the curriculum. There is that canon, there is that kind of hierarchical element. There's that phrase in the current national curriculum that says key text. What do we mean by that? What are we saying by that? What's implied? I grew up, my dad is a child of the empire, I suppose, and so read lots and lots of books, but that canon was very much the English canon. There are, if we look at classics as an example, that it's perfectly possible to choose modern and contemporary classics. For example, from the early years, Anna McQuinn, Bethan Wolven, moving up, S.F. Said, his book Vajapur, Tiger, things like that, David Armand Skellig, Catherine Johnson's work, which is fantastic secondary author for young adults. Mallory Blackman is well known to everyone. It's completely possible to see those as canons and classics, if you like, but have those that don't include the racial stereotypes or any other kind of stereotypes. The part of the reason we're thinking about racially minoritized peoples is because it's across the sector of disadvantage, socioeconomic disadvantage, and disproportionately so, boys and so on. If you're going to teach classics, you need to make sure there's enough engagement with positive representations and centred representations of characters, plot lines, lives and worlds, so that you can then look at a classic text, for example, Secret Garden, that has some problematic representation, what it stands for. You want your Year 6 children to be able to unpick that, to critically engage with that. You need enough to be able to do that before you get there. And right now, one of our things we're keeping an eye on is there's been an unprecedented drop in representation in picture books, which has never happened in the life of the survey. And it is really difficult to find books that aren't animal characters as main characters for young children, and that is a problem for our earliest readers.
Thank you. Go back to Dan.
And can I ask where, and I'll open this to the whole panel, where does the responsibility lie for ensuring that children have got access to books where they see themselves represented, where there is a range of backgrounds and experiences, be that ethnicity, heritage, boys seeing themselves represented in positive characters which are going to be attractive to them? Where is that about creators creating more? Onyinye, you mentioned marketing more. Is it about libraries stocking them, school leaders promoting them, parents buying them? What's going to be the best levers to seeing change in this, do you think?
I can have a very quick stab. I think probably the 2 or 3 main places would be, and we've kind of touched on all of these, but the role of parents definitely comes in, and actually the way we frame it towards parents, rather than being, especially in the early years, this is kind of parenting advice or parenting course or something like that, because all parents will say, well, this is my kid, I know it better. Framing it around, here is some advice for how to help your child succeed, because obviously every parent wants their child to succeed. I think also when we talk about teaching, if we look at obviously the teaching workforce, but then the books that we promote when it's kind of classroom-based learning, can we then tailor them to things that might be more typically male interests, like war, sci-fi, fantasy, comedy, all those kinds of things that might be more coded that way. And then I think finally probably one that I would love to see picked up slightly is the role of men in wider society. I think one of the big things that we need to push for is volunteering. We know men are less likely to volunteer, but actually having those positive male role models within schools, and there are really good examples of this across the UK. I mean, school readers are in thousands of schools. We work with a small charity called Lads Need Dads, who work with boys who don't have dads at home, and they then bring these, they've worked in about 29 schools in the east of England. They bring in men from the community, and they sit for 12 weeks, 1 hour a week, with a boy who's struggling for whatever reason and doesn't have their dad at home, and they just read to them for an hour. They'll do a range of other things too in terms of emotional literacy, but building the relationship there, and then they can highlight things like, what are you interested in? I was told one story of an Irish traveller boy who never read, didn't like reading. First time he met the mentor was just shadow boxing around the room, but they realised obviously he likes boxing. Say, okay, right, next week will you read if I bring Muhammad Ali's autobiography? And he's like, oh yeah, all right then, fine. And they did, and he loved it, and they had a really good 11 weeks. But it's partly building that relationship and then also finding their interests. And I think we have to be proactive as teachers and volunteers more widely in saying, if certain groups, particularly in this sense boys, aren't reading, what might be things that boys are more likely to read?
I'd really like to think about maybe expanding the definition of reading. I think that's really important. Reading cannot be and shouldn't be limited to books alone, and I think that picks up some of the things that the panel's discussed. We want them to read other media, online articles, magazines, comics, audiobooks. These are all very valid formats for reading and can really help break down some of those barriers around accessibility for dyslexic readers. Or I'm thinking about dyslexia being having quite a strong hereditary component. So you might well be in a family where your parents or your carers may struggle with their confidence around reading. So there needs to be, if we can think more widely about what constitutes reading, I think that would help break down some of that, both the representation issues, but also some of the accessibility issues that I think dyslexic children in particular face.
And I think, sorry, just to jump in on final thoughts with that, is that you need to be literate. You want to be able to access, enjoy, and make meaning from a really wide range of texts, and we wouldn't want to advocate for some texts are just gateways into other texts. Actually, literate adults will read, as I imagine all of us in this room will read a wide range of different kinds of texts. You need to see yourself in a wide range of texts.
I'm really sorry, we do need to keep focused on so the question was about whose responsibility is it, what should the government do?
Yeah, so, everyone's, and I think it can come through the recommendations as well, and experts.
Yep. Just going to be really quick. I think publishers hold a really significant responsibility in this. Beyond the marketing and distribution, which I spoke about, is actually about the end to tokenism, where it comes to representation. We don't need just one book about, like the experience of these, children. I think it's important to make sure that there is, like we said, we spoke about choice in the previous panel. It's important there is choice. I think a lot of times where it comes to diverse creators, it's like, oh, this person has done a book about shoes. Okay, no more books about shoes now, that's enough. Well, actually, we do need more choice so that children have that ownership of what they're reading. I think the issue is schools and libraries are so underfunded, where I don't want to place the responsibility on them because, there's only so much that they can do. But it is really important that they are able to make sure that they they give students or children and the community access to diverse literature. And there needs to be just financial investment from the government. As a teacher, I have purchased books to share with my students, which out of my own money, which is because maybe my school is not able to fund that specific part. And so it's really important that we do that as well, financially supporting actually with the government.
Thank you very much. And we'll go to Peter.
Luke, you already outlining in really helpful detail some of the reasons why boys are less likely to read for pleasure than girls. I wanted to ask specifically about the connection between, we know that there is both a gap in reading for pleasure and also in reading attainment, and what the connection is between those two things, if there is a connection.
Yes. To be honest, I'm probably not the expert on what the actual connection is. I do think when thinking about the other kind of correlations we see for reading for pleasure, there are a few that are of interest, might not be causational, but definitely do link with a range of things. Particularly when we look at screen time in the early years, we know that all kids, or 90% of kids, are exceeding clinical guidelines. So there's no screen time under the age of 2, according to the WHO, and then an hour max from 2 to 4. 90% of kids, so almost all of them, are exceeding them. But within that, we know that boys are also quite a lot higher than girls. So there does seem to be boys being pushed towards screen more. This is from parents, at least, when they're surveyed. The other was when we looked at older boys, because we know that kind of 15, 16-year-old age bracket were the least likely to read. There is also a lot to be said around physical activity, which I think really plays a role within that. It's about 15% of boys get the recommended guideline in terms of physical activity they should be getting a week. So I know it's not strictly linked to kind of the link between reading for pleasure and attainment, but I do think there is a whole range of other things that are linked to reading for pleasure that actually, if we settled on them, we might get positive results from the others too.
And I know you mentioned confidence being really important in your opening remarks. Is there anything you could add there on that connection?
I probably would talk about unidentified need as well. I think that's really important. That applies to girls, boys, it applies to all children. But I think if you have children who are not supported or not identified and have additional needs, you know, you're going to be, I know, for example, in the case of dyslexia, if children aren't identified, they might be seen as underperforming, not paying attention, disengaged. You know, they're not taught appropriately, and obviously that will severely affect confidence. And I think importantly, obviously it affects mental well-being. I mean, 70% of dyslexic young people say that it makes them feel bad about themselves. What I think is really interesting is we see it in attainment, and I think those are intrinsically linked. If you enjoy something, you're much more likely to be good at it. If you struggle with something, that's going to be something you avoid trying to do. So, for example, we see that there's real consequences in not being identified. And obviously this is just dyslexia, but I think it applies to a lot of unidentified need and SEND. So around 40% of dyslexic pupils pass GCSE English and Maths, compared to 70% of non-dyslexic peers. That's a 30 percentage gap point. That is exactly the same as Key Stage 2 expected levels of reading, maths and English. Those are going to be intrinsically linked. If you're not enjoying reading, and reading is a foundational skill to be able to access the whole curriculum, not just for pleasure, although I think that's very important, but also for just being able to attain. So I think there's some really key barriers in place, which obviously some of it might affect boys more, but we can also see disadvantage, a really key aspect. So, for example, dyslexia is a diagnosis that has no medical pathway. There's no free diagnosis of dyslexia. So it is only really available to parents who have a certain income. And we can see that 90% of children in higher income households are diagnosed with dyslexia, compared to 43% in lower income households. Girls are less likely to be identified. Children with additional language are less likely to be identified. Children in more disadvantaged schools are less likely to be identified. So if you're not identified, you know, that's going to shape your experience of school and of pleasure, your pleasure for reading, your pleasure in attending school and engaging with the topics in school. So I think it is really, really important that it's not ascribed to a lack of interest.
Yeah,
I think that lack of really accessible pathway.
That's really important, and we do see obviously this crisis that's affecting all of our young people, but in particular the statistics are very alarming for boys. So just to go back to what we can do to encourage more boys to read for pleasure, Luke, as I say, you've already outlined some possible measures. Is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, thank you. So I think starting from some of our focus groups, one of the things that was most interesting was when we would ask, you know, young people, particularly the young boys that we were talking to, what do you want to be when you grow up? It was always either an influencer or a sportsman, and if it was a sportsman, it was basically always a footballer. So when we're talking about interests, I think if we can get more autobiographies of footballers into schools, that'd be a great start. I think also we know that the way that boys work in education is they're much more vision aligned. So if you can tell them, rather than just saying do this because, you know, I'm your teacher and you're my pupil, actually boys often need to know, why am I doing this, what's the point, what am I going to get from this? So if we can do that within reading, that helps. I think we've talked about this kind of gendered problem within reading, that it kind of is the way it is. One teacher I know has a group called Pros Before Bros, and there's a way, it's a little bit like on the nose and it's a little bit male coded, but perhaps that's kind of the thing that we need. I think also I mentioned physical activity. Within that, so there's good schemes like the Daily Mile or more PE in schools, which are quite, I think, obvious solutions to cultivate an environment where boys are more likely to regulate themselves and therefore read after. The other thing I would add is outdoor learning is a really key thing that's missed, particularly within primary schools. So there's an academic called Gemma Goldenberg who has done some research on this and found that boys were 3 times more likely to stay on task when they were doing exactly the same classes, exactly the same teachers, but they were just outdoors. And it was also in kind of central London, so you don't need to be in this nice countryside rolling hills. But if we can change the environment where boys are more likely to regulate themselves, that actually might be more conducive to an environment where they're willing to sit down, have the patience that it requires to read.
So your think tank has particularly highlighted reading mentors in schools as one intervention. Have you found that that helps reading for pleasure as well as reading attainment?
I don't have hard data on it, but anecdotally, yes. So I think part of that is that they can see there is a man who is reading to them. Yeah. Therefore, they see this as an activity that I can get involved in, right? I mean, I would also add that the whole range of benefits for reading, one of the key things they do within those sessions is that one-to-one, they always start with a bit of a check-in. So it's, you know, they'll give the child the language for how are you feeling, and they can use the emotional language and develop emotional literacy. And yes, that's good for reading, but I think that has much wider implications that we really need to maximise.
Where I would slightly push back on some of the fantastic contributions we've heard today is this idea that having diverse range of reading material, including reading material that speaks to the identities of white working class boys and their aspirations, is the goal in and of itself. You know, reading is about seeing yourself in the literature, as we've talked about, but it's also about opening yourself up to different perspectives and feeling the feelings of somebody very different from yourself and seeing the world from their perspectives. So where I would just slightly like to sort of ask you to sort of maybe bring it wider is how can we use a boy picking up a book about a footballer and getting into reading to make sure that he is also, as part of his reading journey, enjoying reading books about a girl from a very different background, racial background. How do we make sure that it's not just narrowly about that one thing, but how we're using the pathway in to then widen perspectives?
Very quick. So I totally agree that I think one of the best things about reading is the reason it develops empathy is because it allows you to put yourself in the mind and the eyes of someone else and see the world through their perspective. The challenge we have at the moment, though, is that 25% of boys enjoy reading for pleasure, which means 3/4 don't. So as much as I agree, I think our first port of call has to be, how do we get boys reading? And that then has to be, what are they interested in at the moment? Once we get them reading, I totally agree, we can widen that. And we've talked a lot about representation and a diverse range of characters and storylines. But I think the first port has to be, what are they interested in now? Let's get them reading books, and then they'll go wander.
Just in terms of primary, I suppose, early years and primary school perspectives, the first thing I suppose is to say and remind ourselves there are more differences within groups of boys and within groups of girls than between boys and girls, and I think that is pretty well established from research, and also that the gender gap is smaller than the disadvantage gap when it comes to GCSE. It's also really important, therefore, to not to reinforce any kind of stereotypes, as we've talked about with the gendered, especially the early kind of formative experiences. So, for example, boys are reluctant or weak readers and labelled quite early on, or they're more into non-fiction than they will be stories. Actually, what we find is, quite simply, one of the main approaches is reading aloud for all children, but reading aloud is literally an active process. You're not just imagining a character, you are in that world being that character. And so there's some interesting brain research around what happens when you are listening to a book read aloud to you. You are literally running when that character is running in your mind. So that's a really important and active learning experience. Obviously, all of this relies on a teacher knowledge of the child. Text with strong human themes really engage boys, but all children. Active and social, there's collaborative approaches. And one thing you said that we've really noticed with our teachers when we're asking them to measure engagement is that sense of agency and responsibility. So the collaborative work, the active work, the way in which that might evolve through performance reading and negotiating. So that's really important. Enacting and dramatic approaches are super effective, and constantly making those connections between their social and home lives, their popular culture lives, and the lives and texts in school, and then of course.
I'm really sorry.
broadening
We've got 3 more questions in about 7 minutes, so I'm going to have to ask you to be super brief, and you can write to us afterwards if there's detail that you're not able to convey, but we need to be super brief at this point.
I just wanted to be really quick where it comes to recommendations for boys. I think one thing is the role of sort of visual aids, so like older picture books, graphic novels, comic books. I mean, we know they work. They've worked over the years where it comes to boys and comic books and superheroes, and even where it comes to like changing those storylines, but making sure that we are giving them a different way of reading, because we know that they're visual, we know that they love the social media and the scrolling and all that sort of stuff. Having, you know, when I started this elective and seeing the shift, and like now pretty much most of the elective is just key stage 3, year 7 to year 9 boys, and just like doing action and drawing, all that sort of stuff. And like one of them was so engaged that he actually printed his own book and was sharing it across the school. And they're like, Miss, have you seen this year 8 boys book? And I'm like, yeah. And they're all so excited because it's about them, and it's kind of got, you know, they're doing their little drawing, their stickmen, they love it. So it's about, like you said, looking at what they like. They love like visual stuff. So I think it's really important to kind of push them onto older picture books, graphic novels, you know, speaking to the publishers about that, but also the teachers and the librarians to focus on getting more of that for the boys.
Thank you. We're going to go to Serena.
Thank you. This question is for Ellen, and I'd like to thank you for sharing the real experiences of too many children and young people who have dyslexia. You spoke about feelings of fear and failure and a stigma, and how reading can be such an uncomfortable, exhausting experience. So how can schools be more inclusive in their practice to support children and young people with dyslexia as well as other SEND?
Thank you, Serena. I mean, I think schools have a really vital role in shaping children's relationship with reading. I think we talk about the family, and that's really important, but schools are really, really important. They can either reinforce an idea, I think, around where reading is difficult and exclusive and only for some, or something where, in a really inclusive reading culture, where every child can be a reader. And I think for me, in terms of what they can do differently, or what we see really good examples across the country of schools doing when they do it really well, because there's plenty of really amazing schools out there, and I'm happy to give some recommendations to the committee if you want to do some visits to some great schools who do this really well. They offer a really wide range of formats. They have assistive technology embedded as a matter of course from Key Stage 2 at least. They ensure their staff, teaching support staff, and reading volunteers, which often a lot of children is who teaches children how to read, are trained to support children with reading difficulties, to spot signs and to intervene properly. And they are also, I think, really moving away from that really narrow definition of reading as decoding text. It's about enjoying the content. It's about reading age-appropriate stuff. So the thing that applies or that is attractive to a 14-year-old is not going to be the same as is attractive to an 8-year-old. But if your reading is really, really slow and cumbersome, you still need to access age-appropriate stuff when you're 14. And if that's through an audiobook, a graphic novel, or a comic strip, I think it doesn't really matter, because it's about all the other things that you learn, complex syntax, or complex character developments, or richer vocabulary, or technical language, all things that children and young people really need. So I think it's really about, I come back to it, but I think it's really important that we think of reading not only about books. Reading is much wider. It is for all of you, it's for all of us, and I think we need to sort of take that into schools. I'd also be really keen to talk about some of the things that I think would make a really big difference on a system level, not just in schools, because all the schools can do some really great stuff. They need to be supported by the right structures and processes. I think we need better identification of reading difficulties. I think the phonic tests at the end of year 1 really isn't working. I think too many children are taught to that test, pass it, but turns out they cannot fluently and competently read and comprehend after that, and it really impinges. So it needs to become more of a guide to intervention for teachers rather than a benchmark to how well your school is doing, and I'd really like to see some progress on that. I would also really encourage the committee to look at the year 8 reading test that's been proposed. I think that's far too late. If you've come to year 8 and you're struggling with your reading, you have missed many years of schooling and many years of potentially enjoying reading and accessing the curriculum in full. I think also there's also some really fantastic stuff in the Send White Paper that I really welcomed, and I think will make a big difference to children with dyslexia. But there are also some things that I think I would really encourage the committee to look again at the curriculum and assessment review and the response to that. I think some of that really goes against the grain of what children with SEND need to enjoy schooling. And it retains a very inflexible and rigid system for both curriculum teaching, which really narrows their representation and all the other things, but also means that children won't shine and they won't be putting their best foot forward.
On that final point that you've made, it would be helpful if you could write some additional information to the committee.
Absolutely.
Specifically around the curriculum and assessment
very happy
review.
to follow up on that.
Really helpful. Thank you very much. Darren.
Thank you. Ellen, just quickly linking into something you said earlier about comics, graphic novels, e-books, e-readers and so on. There are differences of opinion. Some have produced evidence saying that actually they may not bring the same benefits to children as reading a traditional book. So what's your thoughts on that? Where's the balance? Where's the point of ensuring that they get into it in a way that is most enjoyable, but that they don't miss out on the long-term benefits of reading traditional books? There's a sweet spot.
I think it will depend on the child, and it will depend on what the age they're at. But I think, Luke's point around get them in and then introduce is probably quite a good one. I was thinking that as a teacher myself. If you can get someone really interested in a comic book because that speaks to them, because there's a character that they like, or the language is decodable for them, maybe next time you stick an audiobook on so you can hear the sentence structure that's maybe more complex, or the plot development that's more complex. So I think it's about sort of getting them in early. But I also think there's something about if your early experiences of reading aren't so challenging, and you constantly have access to the content that you want that is enjoyable, I think there will be less of a barrier to the reading itself as well, and you might be willing to, because at the moment it's so effortful that you only do it when you really have to. If it was slightly less effortful because we'd tried harder and we intervened earlier and you were supported earlier to be a competent and fluent reader, we'd see fewer barriers further down the line. But I take your point, but I think it has to be a judgment that teachers and professionals make around children and young people's access both to reading for pleasure but also reading for attainment, because I think they're really intrinsically linked.
And that kind of exposure to sort of multiple...
Absolutely, and they all teach different language as well. I think we sometimes don't talk about gaming, and gaming is something that a lot of children and young people really like. You can learn a lot from that, which may not appear in your traditional, in Jane Eyre or Jane Austen or Charles Dickens, but is quite useful for modern life. I think a really key way is thinking about technology actually for children and young people. They think it's fun, they think it's modern, so utilising things that you have around technology I think is really, really important to hook them in.
Because we're so short on time, I'm going to go to Serena for a final question.
Okay, so a final recommendation in terms of encouraging children who come from largely disadvantaged backgrounds, lower income households, for a recommendation for national government in terms of supporting those children in terms of reading for pleasure. So I will start off with Anjali.
I think we can definitely give recommendations that we, in response to the CAR, and I'm happy to send that on later. But fundamentally, we need to make sure that national curriculum from a school perspective is rich and it's inclusive and cohesive, because what's happened at the moment, certainly over the last 10-15 years, and we've seen this through the teacher training that we do, is that it's become a disparate curriculum. Reading and writing and oracy is separate, and we need it to be cohesive. I think we try to simplify it, as has always happened with reading, to make it more accessible, perhaps, to make it more accessible to teachers as well. But I think we absolutely need to make sure that whatever we do to design a curriculum, it's not placing a higher status on skills, but it is really about how we explore comprehension alongside the skills, the knowledge and the behaviours. There are key approaches that work, which I'm happy to send on
just
to
looking
you.
for really quick answers, because we're over.
But I
we're
think
over time.
we definitely are disappointed in the primary sector and English associations and the primary associations at what has been. We don't want too much change for teachers. That's not what we're hearing from teachers.
I need to move us on, I'm afraid.
Onyinye?
Yeah, I'm going to be really quick. Funding school libraries, funding libraries outside of school to make sure that there is access for the for the children and the parents. Make sure that there is that contact with creators in school, so author visits, illustrator visits, so that there is that link with the books and there is their engagement, and as well sustaining community initiatives which are already there, which are happening all the time but are being defunded. So it's important to make sure that we are looking at grassroots literacy movements that are connected to these families and communities that are not supported, and they're the ones that actually need. They're already doing the work. All we need to do is support them.
Thank you. Luke?
I'd go really hard on volunteering. I think if you can get a volunteering workforce who can come in, do the one-to-one, relational, get their interests off them, particularly if you can buck the trend and try and find either the same or more men, I think that will go a long way.
Excellent. Thank you. And Ellen?
I would probably echo some of the stuff around school libraries. I think ensuring access to a really wide range of materials and formats is really, really key, and schools are a key place to do that. But I think we also, alongside that, and assistive tech, alongside that, we really need to train and support our teachers and head teachers and school staff to make sure that they have access to that, that they have money and funding and capacity to teach and to have that access to that full set of formats.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, we have been really constrained on time today. It's always the case. If there are additional things that you weren't able to get across in the time that we had, please do write to the committee afterwards. We would really welcome that.
Thank you.
Very, very much indeed for coming to give your evidence today. That brings our session to a close. Order.